Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. This week I cover a politician from another South Asian country, Pakistan. Pakistan is one of my favourite countries to read about, so there were many potential candidates for the subject of this episode. However, given recent events in the country, I have settled on Imran Khan, who was, until April the 10th of this year, Pakistan's Prime Minister, when he was removed from office after a controversial no-confidence vote. Khan's removal has unleashed a tidal wave of polarisation in the physical and virtual worlds, with protests and pro-Khan rallies erupting across Pakistan, and conspiracy theories and partisan reporting littering Twitter. Many around Khan, who had been Prime Minister since 2018, have blamed the Biden administration for instigating a coup against their leader, after Khan visited Vladimir Putin only hours after the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Whether or not this is true, Khan's short premiership is a warning against angering the military. Pakistan is, to a great extent, an army with a country, rather than a country with an army, in the sense that the military has played a part in determining the government of the country since its founding, and has instigated coups against civilian governments on at least 3 occasions. Whilst it is often said that Pakistan is currently in a period of civilian rule, there is little doubt that the army played a role in both the rise and fall of Imran Khan. Therefore, direct military rule and indirect military rule might be a better dichotomy to use in the Pakistani case than military rule and civilian rule. My guest for this conversation is Declan Walsh. Declan is currently the chief Africa correspondent for the New York Times, and he used to cover Pakistani politics for The Guardian, before he was kicked out of Pakistan in 2013. Declan has documented his experiences in the country in his 2020 book, The 9 Lives of Pakistan, which I highly recommend reading. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Imran Khan. Good morning, Declan. How are you?
Good morning, Tom. Nice to be with you.
We're talking about Imran Khan today, Declan, a man who was, until very recently, the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He was removed from office on the 10th of April of this year. He was born in Lahore in 1952, and of course he's a politician who is many ways better known for the career he had before politics. He's considered one of the greatest cricketers of all time. I don't know whether you're a fan of cricket yourself, but can you start by talking about the cultural importance of cricket in Pakistan and how it helped Imran Khan as a public figure and as a politician?
Well, cricket is one of the few truly unifying forces in Pakistan. It's this country that in many ways has been characterized by divisions between regions, between parties, between religious beliefs since its foundation in 1947. And it's said, the hackneyed phrase is, that the only things that unify Pakistan are supposed to be the army and Islam. Arguably, neither of those contentions are actually true. But the one thing that all Pakistanis share in common is really this absolute passion for the game of cricket. And Imran Khan is, without a doubt, the most celebrated Pakistani cricketer of many, many decades, arguably of all time. He led the national cricket team to win the World Cup in 1992. He was the captain of that team for about a decade. And he brought great skill to the game. He's if not the greatest, then one of the greatest cricketers himself. But also, he brought this great glamour to the game at a period in the 70s through the 80s and the 90s when he was at the top of his career, and he sort of seemed to, at least in the public eye, divide his time between cricket for the Pakistani national side, but also spending a lot of time in the UK in particular, where he was part of this sort of, airbrushed 80s glamour scene that, revolved around the locales of Stringfellows nightclub. He was in a string of relationships with glamorous society women that were huge tabloid fodder, and sort of crowned all of this by marrying Jemima Khan, who at the time was the daughter of, I mean, a socialite and the daughter of one of the richest people in the world at that time, Jimmy Goldsmith, and brought Imran Khan brought Jemima back to Pakistan with him, and they had two sons. So Khan is this absolutely combustible combination of a sports superstar and a sex symbol, and someone who I think, as one guy once said, women want to be with him and men want to be him.
He was 40 when Pakistan won the World Cup in 1992. What was his first foray into politics?
So he moved towards politics pretty early on. He won the World Cup in '92. He founded his own political party called the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, or Movement for Justice, in 1996. But it got off to a very slow start, his political career. He spent a good 15 years really floundering about in the wilderness. He flirted politically with many different versions of politics. In the beginning, he avoided, a strong association with Islam. Later, he allied with the military ruler of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf. In 2002, he threw himself behind this very contentious referendum that Musharraf held, which was basically a sort of popularity contest about himself that Musharraf organized. It was heavily rigged, influenced by the spy service, and Imran Khan threw his weight behind that. Now, later he publicly regretted it, but it was a sign of how, as Imran Khan was trying to convert this huge public popularity he had, by most measures, he was the most popular person in the country, but he really struggled to convert that kind of incandescent celebrity and popularity into votes. He only won his party won its first seat in Parliament, I think, in 2002, and that was just one single seat. And I remember I moved to Pakistan as a correspondent in 2004, and I went to see Imran in the Parliament lodges where the parliamentarians live, or are lodged beside the Parliament in Islamabad in 2005. And at that time, he really cut this kind of slightly lost figure. He had a single seat in Parliament. He was, at that point, had turned his back on Musharraf. He was starting to vote with some of the more extreme fundamentalist parties in Pakistan, the religious parties. He was, his ex-wife, but at this point, he had been divorced from Jemima Khan for a number of years. She was making tabloid headlines at the time for being off in the Caribbean on holidays with her then boyfriend, Hugh Grant. Imran was, doing cricket commentary for Indian channels to make some extra money. He had a single seat in Parliament, and he was kind of struggling to find takers for his ideas, very much this guy in the wilderness. Now, to be fair, he had also, some years earlier, he'd set up this hospital called the Shaukat Khan Memorial Hospital in Lahore, which was Pakistan's first major cancer treatment facility. He set it up in the memory of his mother, who had died from cancer. This hospital, by all accounts, was very well run and was providing a fantastic public service, and received, through his celebrity, a lot of donations and a lot of money. So he had goodwill through that, but politically was, as I said, was struggling. So it really took him until the elections in 2008. He started to make some progress, but really until the elections in 2013 and in the years preceding that he suddenly chanced upon this formula that really chimed with the Pakistani youth in particular, and shot him from being this kind of no-hoper who was kind of, prior to that, really mocked by a lot of people. I mean, I remember when I got to Pakistan, people would call him Taliban Khan because he seemed to be making excuses for the rise of the Pakistani Taliban, who of course were, carrying out a lot of violent attacks in the country at the time. And then he was sort of looked down upon by the elite in Lahore, which is the city that he's from. And indeed, in one of the big English language papers in Lahore, they had a satirical column about him every week, which was supposedly written in his voice. I mean, it was clearly a satire, but it was called In the Dim.
You mentioned quite a lot of different strands of Pakistani politics there, Declan. I want to just sort of go over a couple of things just to be clear. During the sort of 90s and 2000s, Pakistan obviously flitted between civilian rule and rule by the military. First of all, can you explain a little bit about the influence of the army in Pakistani politics a bit more directly? Pakistan has obviously been a country since the late 1940s, but the army has been a sort of constant throughout that. What are the specifics of their influence?
The army has been really the controlling force in Pakistan's governments, both civilian and military, for most of the country's history. The first coup took the first decade of Pakistan's existence from 1947 on was very politically chaotic. There were a lot of governments and leaders that fell and went. The country was really struggling to establish itself as a stable place after the bloodshed of partition. There had been disputes over the division of assets between India and Pakistan after the departure of the British. And the sort of, at that point, the forces in the country that were seen as the only stabilizing solid forces were the remnants of the colonial bureaucracy and the military. So the first coup took place in 1958, and really for most of the decades that followed, you had a succession of periods of either long periods of direct military rule, punctuated by conflicts with India. And then from the late 80s, early 90s on, you had a number of democratic governments, but those democratically elected governments were frequently destabilized by meddling from the military, which was absolutely determined to maintain its grip on really the key policy issues in Pakistan, which are foreign policy issues, certainly, which are the relationship with India, Pakistan's dealings with Afghanistan, to some degree, the relationship with the United States as well. So there were governments that fell and rose, led by these old dynastic families, the Bhutto family led by Benazir Bhutto, and later by the Sharif family of Nawaz Sharif. So the military has always been the strongest force in politics, either when politicians are in charge or not. And kind of the story of Pakistan over the last decade in particular has been how the country has been trying to pull away from that domination by the military to establish, a truly democratic system where the institutions are able to stand on their own 2 feet and behave impartially. And arguably, I think they've had very mixed success, but there certainly has been some success, particularly since the fall of Pervez Musharraf, who was the military leader who came to power in 1999 and ruled until 2008. And really, Musharraf was the last outright military ruler that Pakistan has had, but arguably the military has still kept a strong hand on the way the country has run since then.
You mentioned the Pakistan Movement for Justice, the party that Imran Khan set up in 1996. It doesn't sound as if Khan has a particularly fixed ideological view of politics, either in Pakistan or in the rest of the world. But if we look at the period post 2008, when, as you said, the military leader Musharraf resigned, you've gone from a situation where the Pakistan Movement for Justice has been basically a sideshow in politics in 2008 to a situation in 2018 where it's now the largest party in Pakistan. What do you think has changed? Do you think that Khan has just essentially filled a vacuum created by fairly unimpressive, corrupt political parties? Or has he actually offered a genuinely popular and different political program?
I think he he tapped into some very powerful emotions inside the Pakistani electorate. You got to remember that at that period, during the Musharraf years, the country had been rocked by, you know, endless explosions, endless bombings by the Pakistani Taliban and other extremist groups. There was a war going on across the border in Afghanistan involving the United States that was hugely unpopular in Pakistan. And the Americans were carrying out pretty regular drone strikes in Pakistan's tribal belt, going after Al-Qaeda and other terrorist suspects. So Khan tapped into a couple of things at once. He tapped into people's frustration with the United States, and he adopted a very strident anti-American policy. At one point, I remember when his star was rising, he led this kind of caravan of supporters into the tribal belt. It was this very unusual coalition of Pakistani supporters and also American pacifist activists, a group called Code Pink, and they led this little caravan into a corner of the tribal belt to protest against these drone strikes, and that was hugely popular. So he tapped into that. He also tapped into frustration with the old dynastic politics, the fact that civilian politics, even when it had been dominant, was dominated by these 2 or 3 large families, the Bhuttos and the Sharifs, namely. And he tapped into frustration with this idea that politics was riven with corruption. This is an idea, of course, that the military had been very strongly encouraging for years in order to justify their political actions. But nonetheless, corruption is objectively a huge problem in Pakistan. And Khan promised, through his own example of the hospital that he led, the cancer hospital, he sort of said, well, I ran this cancer hospital in a very reputable way. I'm going to shed the old dynastic politics, and I'm going to bring in a new kind of politics that is effectively corruption-free. And I'm not going to be beholden to these Western institutions, like the Western-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, and I'm going to lead a new type of economic reform in the country. And I would say, lastly, Pakistan is a very young country. 2/3 of the country is under the age of 30. And as we discussed at the beginning, people are crazy about Pakistan. They adore him. They admire him. They fancy him or fancied him. And so, in this very stultified political scene, Khan offered this dynamic, exciting, some even said sort of sexy alternative that young Pakistanis came behind and are backed in their throngs. So all of these factors, came together really from 2008 after the fall of Musharraf, but particularly I would say from the election in 2013, where you could see, I was in Pakistan at that time, and you could see over the preceding couple, year or 2 years, he just started attracting. He started attracting 10, sometimes perhaps even over 100,000 people to these ginormous rallies that were kind of crackling with excitement, and they were glamorous. He had music and dancing, and he had from an early point, he had a very strong social media presence. His supporters were absolutely avid and very kind of aggressive sometimes on social media, but he was tapping into something new, and that excited people, and I think that's what brought him into power in the first place from the election in 2018 when he finally became prime minister.
Yes, he became prime minister in August of 2018 following the election in July. I can't imagine that he is the first politician in Pakistan to kind of rail against corruption and try and claim for himself a type of economic reform. In terms of the economic reform and anti-corruption programs that he was promising, what were the specifics of those, and how successful do you think he has actually been in that?
What he promised really was to wash away the old order. So in Pakistani politics, they have a term called electables. And electable is a kind of synonym for a powerful person in a local constituency who's probably the candidate for parliament, and who may have his influence and sway in the community or in that area, maybe because his family has a lot of land. They're sort of sometimes called feudal landlords or quasi-feudal landlords, or maybe they come from a family that has a heritage of being in Sufism, so they have a kind of religious authority. Pakistan is a huge and obviously very rural country. So across the country, you have these local power brokers who have traditionally been the key to these dynastic parties coming to power and holding on to power. And Khan came in and he said, well, I'm going to get rid of corruption because, of course, these local power brokers give their support to political parties at a price, and that price is usually access to money or funds in some shape or form. And he's like, I'm going to sweep away all of this. I'm going to bring in new dynamic leadership into the country, and that's how we're going to run things. And the problem for him really was that he very quickly ran into the reality that it's very hard to wash away this system in one fell swoop in Pakistan. It's so ingrained and embedded in the fabric of society and of politics. And it was almost naive to promise that he would get rid of it so quickly. And indeed, once he got into power, he struggled. He for one thing, he had to turn to some of these people, these electables, these power brokers, to get elected. And once he was in power, he really struggled to implement an anti-corruption agenda. He had a couple of initiatives where he tried to appeal, particularly to people in the Pakistani diaspora, for funds and so on to help to bolster the country's finances. And he claimed that he was not going to appoint people on the basis of nepotism and so on. But he struggled to implement these reforms, and at the same time, he arguably mismanaged the economy. Inflation started to soar into double digits. The economy was really suffering. And so he's caught in this bind where he's promising to, a keystone of his platform is that he's going to get rid of corruption. And at the same time, that's not happening, and people's living standards are starting to erode. So he immediately starts coming under pressure, and in many ways, I think that was the foundation, or that was really the start of the problems. I think, among others, that led to his being ousted from office last month on a no confidence vote.
I certainly want to turn to the events of the last few weeks later on. I want to ask you first about the kind of foreign policy side of Khan. Pakistan's obviously a very significant country in international affairs. It shares a long border and history with Afghanistan, and for many years the Pakistani military and intelligence services backed the Taliban, much to the annoyance of the US. It has a long-standing rivalry with India. It shares quite a long border with China. Leaving Khan to one side for a second, to what extent do you think can any Pakistani prime minister drastically alter the foreign policy of the country? Is this in reality the domain of the military?
This is basically the domain of the military, and civilian leaders who have tried to forcefully change those policies have often come a cropper. And indeed, in the 1990s, when Benazir Bhutto rose and fall and Nawaz Sharif rose and fall, it often seemed to be that when they tried to take the initiative, for instance, particularly on the relationship with India, that they started running into real problems with the military that started, manipulating things behind the scenes to oust them from power. And indeed, the government that preceded Imran, the government that ruled from 2008, led by Benazir Bhutto's husband, Asif Ali Zardari, had also, just before it fell, it had started to reach out to India or make statements about India that the military didn't like, and I think that was probably a factor in some of the movement against that government as well. So India, Afghanistan, to some degree, the relationship with the United States and the money that the Pakistani money and military assistance the military has received from the US, these have been very difficult, very sensitive issues for civilian leaders, because they find themselves having to deal with public opinion on the one side and manage that. On the other side, they have the military, particularly in the form of its intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, which not only has been very active in promoting Pakistan's goals in Indian-occupied Kashmir or in Afghanistan, where they've supported proxy forces, but is also has at least traditionally had a very strong role in meddling in the politics of the country. And to get back to our earlier point about electables, these local powerful figures who kind of hold the key to winning elections in Pakistan. The ISI has in many elections really tried to bribe, coerce, pressure, influence electables in various areas, to stand for one party or the other in order to sway the overall result of the election.
And bringing Khan into the fold then, in light of those three countries I mentioned, the US, China, and India, how much did Khan want to change foreign relations with them in a fundamental way? I know that, given what you've said, he probably was never in a position to actually do that. But what do you think his view of foreign policy actually is?
Well, you were right to mention China. Of course, China is the huge entrant into Pakistan's foreign policy sphere over the last decade. I mean, the Chinese and the Pakistanis have always had close relations. The Chinese and they've cooperated covertly on nuclear issues and so on. But really, it's just in the last decade and a half, the Chinese have come into Pakistan with these huge packages of financial aid and development, building roads and ports and other things across the country. And so they've become a force, and it's important to mention that. I think, Khan, came to power at a time when, Pakistan's relationship with the US, for one, through the kind of attrition of the war on terror period, was really very poor, and China was rising. And Khan certainly hitched himself to the China wagon, if you like, was a very strong proponent of good relations with China, was notably very reluctant to voice any criticism over Chinese mistreatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang in Western China, which of course is notable because the Uyghurs are a Muslim minority, and Pakistanis are generally, very passionate about the right of, Palestinians and Muslims in Kashmir who are being discriminated against. But there was this sort of huge blind spot when it came to the Uyghurs because of the relationship with Beijing. Khan absolutely refused to criticize China over that. So he certainly allied himself with China. As I said, once his electoral star was rising in the late 2000s, he grew popular by engaging in vociferous criticism of the United States, and that never really stopped. And then when it comes to India, well, Imran Khan, the cricketer and the erstwhile tabloid celebrity, had actually been someone who went to India a lot. He, commentated on cricket for Indian channels. He was sort of seen hanging out with Bollywood film stars in his glamour days and so on. But once he came to power, came into politics, certainly came to power, he became this very hardline, many would say, critic of India and of Indian nationalism. And in some ways, I think, arguably, particularly in recent years, his party has been more anti-India than even parts of the military, which is an astonishing thing to say in Pakistan, but which is always defined, the military has always defined itself against the Indian military. But Pakistan's, Imran Khan's party has been absolutely almost rabidly anti-Indian at some times. Now, of course, you have to look at that in the context of this is also at a time, of course, when in India, Narendra Modi has come to power and is discriminating blatantly against his Muslim population, never mind what's going on in Kashmir. So there was certainly, a fuel to that policy, but you see in some respects Khan's policy on India going even more to the right of the Pakistani military.
I want to move to talk about the events of the last few months, Declan. As you've mentioned, Khan was removed from office about 4 weeks ago. What was the sort of trigger point for this? Can you explain a bit as to what's happened?
I think there were two main factors. One is, as I said, the economy had really suffered under his tenure. Pakistanis had seen their purchasing power go down. The people were really suffering. So that's the most obvious thing. The second thing, I think, is that he lost the support of the military leadership. I spoke a few moments ago about the influence of the ISI on elections. Now, I think to be fair, it's important to note that at the last number of elections, ISI interference or military direct interference in elections has diminished. But nonetheless, when Khan came to power in 2018, there was a very strong sense that the military leadership supported him, that they saw him as, in Pakistan, they call it the blue-eyed boy, as someone who was very close to the military. And indeed, for the first years of his tenure, I mean, Khan was absolutely in lockstep with the military's position on those major issues that we've just been talking about, and in some respects went further than the military. So there was absolutely no conflict there, and in fact, it was a notable government in Pakistan's history, in that it was probably the first one where there was no major friction between the civilian and military parts of the state, largely because Khan's government had abdicated control over these major foreign policy issues already to the military. But that started to change, and there was a period about a year ago where it became clear that the military leadership was actually kind of starting to get tired of Khan and had sent signals that it was tacitly removing its unconditional support for him and his government. This emboldened the opposition to come forward, eventually leading to this vote of no confidence that they tabled against Khan, and led to some very strange contortions where suddenly, in recent weeks, as this drama has played out, we've seen, Khan go from being as I said, what they call the blue-eyed boy of the military, to being quite a vociferous critic, certainly of the military leadership in Pakistan as this political crisis has unfolded.
Arguably, well, self-evidently, he's only become a critic because suddenly he's on the losing side of that equation, though, right?
It certainly seems, if not inconceivable, then it is hard to believe that the opposition would have been able to bring this vote against Khan, would have been able to peel away many people from his own party. People from his own party. Some of these electables we've been talking about, they dropped their support for Khan, allowing this no confidence vote to ultimately to go ahead, and effectively ensuring that Khan's party would lose that vote in the parliament. And it's hard to imagine that would have happened if the military had not, at the very least, taken its thumb off the scales, which is what happened. Just to recap very briefly, when this vote of no confidence came before Parliament, Khan's party manoeuvred very aggressively to stop the Parliament from holding this vote. The Speaker of Parliament, which is from his party, refused to hold the vote, and it suddenly went from being this political standoff into a constitutional crisis, because the matter the opposition parties brought this maneuver before the Supreme Court, which within about a week ruled that indeed it was unconstitutional for Khan's party or for the speaker to refuse to hold this vote. And then in this very dramatic, classic Pakistan moment, Pakistani politics moment, there was a deadline where the court had said this vote has to take place before midnight, I think on a Saturday night, I think it was April 10th. And it went right up to the wire. I think like 2 or 3 minutes before midnight, you had a new speaker installed in Parliament. This vote took place, and Imran Khan was out. But then immediately, once he was out, he started saying that actually this vote had been, or the no confidence motion had been promoted by the United States, and he took a diplomatic cable that had been sent by his own ambassador, by Pakistan ambassador to the U.S., recounting a meeting with a Biden administration official, where this Biden official said informally, in a private conversation, that the US was not happy with a rapprochement between Khan and Russia, because Khan went to visit Vladimir Putin on the first day of the Ukraine war. And suddenly Khan took this report of this conversation, put a version of it out in public, and he said, here's proof that the United States wanted to bring my government down. And so since that happened, he's been holding these huge rallies across the country, trying to keep himself still, even though he's out of power, very much front and center, the focus of attention. It appears that he's trying to force an early election that he hopes will take place on terms that are favorable to him, and at the same time has found himself publicly at odds with the military leadership, because a couple of weeks ago, we had the military spokesman who came out and said publicly that they had examined this conspiracy theory that Khan had been promoting about US meddling to oust him from power, and had decided that it had no basis. So that if ever there was a sign that this close relationship between Imran Khan and the Pakistani military had effectively collapsed, this was it.
In terms of him going around the country and trying to stir up support for his career, what has the response been from the people? I mean, they elected this man only 4 years ago. Do you get a sense of what the Pakistani people actually think of this problem or this crisis that's unfolded?
Well, one thing is clear, is that he retains huge popular support. He's held a number of rallies in the big cities with, if you just look at the images, you'll see tens of thousands, maybe even more people who are coming out and are absolutely impassioned. So we're seeing large crowds. We're seeing a very polarized atmosphere on social media in particular, really kind of in some respects recalls the polarization in the US that happened after Donald Trump became a force in politics. Pakistani politics, like politics everywhere, has always had a degree of polarization, but now it is very strong and very vituperative. And critics say that Khan is creating a kind of dangerous cult of politics, in which the truth doesn't matter. He's propagating this, certainly according to even his allies in the military, this discredited idea about the motion that took him from power. His supporters are repeatedly referring to the government that's in place now, a coalition that's led by the Shahbaz Sharif, as an imported government. So they're not just saying that, they're really trying to discredit them and to portray them as foreign puppets, essentially. So he certainly does have popularity, but and it's very clear that his strategy is to keep himself in the spotlight and to keep a sense of momentum going until he can have until there can be an election and he can return to power by the ballot box. But Pakistani politics are a very very mercurial. It's a very mercurial scene, very unpredictable, and this factor of him being publicly at odds to some degree with the military leadership is the X factor in all of this. The military certainly doesn't like Khan going up against them. He's a very powerful politician, or popular politician, publicly criticizing the military. They certainly don't like that. It's unclear how they're going to react to that. And then to add one further complicating layer, it has also become clear that even within the military there are rifts over Khan. The military leadership certainly doesn't seem to appreciate him, but there are increasingly there's a good number of people in the military rank and file, either retired military officers who can be quite influential in Pakistan, or even some serving military officers who've made it clear in their own way that they're behind Khan, that they see him as someone they want to stay in power. So that's another X factor in all of this, how it's going to resolve inside the military between the core commanders, the military leadership, and certainly a proportion of the rank and file that seems to have thrown itself behind Khan.
On that point, if you think about many leaders Pakistan has had, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Benazir Bhutto, Zia-ul Haq, they all met fairly unpleasant ends. Zulfikar was hanged by the army, Benazir was shot, Zia-ul Haq was blown up. In a way, if all that happens to Khan is that he's just ejected from office, he's arguably had a fairly lucky escape, really, by the standards of his country. Do you think it could be dangerous for him to come back? Do you think there's a serious personal threat to him in what he's doing now?
Pakistani politics is a dangerous game for anyone who plays it. The examples you've given bear that out. And you've got to remember that in the background of all this politicking, you've got, and this is, I think, from my perspective, certainly one of the more substantial criticisms you could make of Imran Khan's period is that, it's a country that has all these unresolved issues. Its relationship with India, but also it's got a large fraternity. It's got a large number of militant groups that are still at large in the country. It has a tribal area, the tribal belt along the border with Afghanistan that is still largely lawless. It has a huge problem with extremism, with instrumentalization of the law against blasphemy by religious extremists to whip up public sentiment. And so whatever the sort of, specific threat there might be against Khan, it is a country where, there's a lot of weapons and there's certainly a lot of unresolved issues, some of them to do with extremism. And that does make it a dangerous place to be a politician. It also means that there's a lot of, if you are a force that wants to do harm to your opponent, there's a lot of these groups that can be instrumentalized sometimes to carry out violent attacks. I mean, even though Benazir Bhutto was killed by a Pakistani Taliban suicide bomber, there's still a lot of unresolved questions and speculation in the country about whether elements of the military were behind this Taliban group that carried out the attack that killed her. So I think it certainly is a dangerous game for Imran Khan. But it's a dangerous arena for anyone who plays in it.
Just as a final question, I was reading Anatol Lieven's book on Pakistan recently. I think it's just called Pakistan. And he made a very interesting remark, which you've sort of hinted at as well, about the army. He said that the reason the army plays such a large role is that it's the only institution in the country that's founded on any sort of meritocracy. Every other state institution is basically just a reflection of tribal interests, of kinship interests. It's a state that's based on negotiation rather than rules. If that's true, does it ever make you wonder whether army rule might actually be a better course for Pakistan than civilian rule?
Well, when you look at the history of the country the last number of decades, you see that there has effectively been army rule, I mean, directly or indirectly, and it's had some pretty disastrous results. You mentioned Zia-ul Haq. During the 80s, Zia empowered the ISI intelligence service, and he also empowered Islamist extremists in order to, prosecute a guerrilla war in Afghanistan and to bolster up his own popularity. And in many respects, we're still seeing the blowback from that period now. We saw it in the rise of the Pakistani Taliban in the 2000s, and we're seeing it in recent years with this just dreadful instrumentalization of blasphemy as something that is used as a law that Zia-ul-Haq introduced. He introduced capital punishment for blasphemy, which has turned it into this very powerful tool for bigots and extremists to discriminate against minorities in the country, and also to sometimes, engage in mainstream politics and hold giant rallies. And in recent years, they have forced government ministers to resign. So I think that the military certainly is probably the best organized institution in the country, and has benefited from a lot of resources of the state to do it. But at the same time, I think it's arguably, when you look at its record, it's taken some pretty terrible decisions that have created the problems where the country is now. I think the bigger question is, how do you transition from a state where the military plays such a huge role into one where democracy can, a democratic system can exist, that has the checks and balances and the institutional strength, if you like, to continue. And that's the experiment we see going on for the last 10 or 15 years since the end of Musharraf. And it's been with mixed results. We still see the military playing a strong role. But, when we saw this court ruling just a couple of weeks ago, where the Supreme Court stepped in to say that Imran Khan's party's efforts to stop this no confidence vote going through was unconstitutional, I mean, that at least was a heartening sign, that here's the Supreme Court that in the past has often basically rubber stamped unconstitutional maneuvers, has rubber stamped military coups, was stepping in to establish its independence. So I think that's, in all of this politicking and mess, I feel that something like that is at least a positive sign.
Declan, thank you very much. That was great. If people, Pakistani politics to me is one of the most interesting political systems in the world. I think it's a fascinating country to look at. And where can people find your work if they want to read up more on Pakistan or anything else that you're doing? Where can they go?
Well, you know that I've written a book, The 9 Lives of Pakistan. So there's quite a bit in that. I covered Pakistan for 10 years for The Guardian and then for the New York Times. So most of what I've written is during that period. And I continued to cover the country actually from London as well after I was kicked out in 2013. So I have a body of work there, and I'd love to go back if I could ever get a visa.
Thank you, Declan.
Okay, great to talk to you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.